Sometimes the coldest moments in life lead us to the warmest hearts. Sometimes being lost is exactly how we find our way home. Montana Territory, 1884. Clara Whitmore, a widow from back east, was dying in a snowstorm when a stranger appeared through the white. Eli McCord, a mountain man who'd hidden from the world for years, spoke 3 simple words: "Follow me home." What started as one night of shelter became a winter of healing. 2 people carrying grief learned to live again. But when spring came and her late husband's family arrived to take her back, Eli had to make a choice. Could a man who'd spent years alone find the courage to fight for love? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Clara Whitmore had worn black for 6 months, though she couldn't honestly say she mourned. That was the truth she carried like a stone in her chest as the wagon rattled westward across the endless Montana Territory, each mile taking her farther from the life she'd known and closer to something she couldn't yet name. The wedding ring on her left hand felt heavier than it should, a thick gold band that Edmund had chosen himself. Like everything else in their marriage, he'd selected her dresses, her friends, the books she read, the words she spoke at dinner parties. For 8 years, she'd been less a wife than a well-dressed ornament in his Boston home. A schoolteacher he'd plucked from modest circumstances and molded into the perfect merchant spouse. When his heart gave out last April, clutching his chest in his study, surrounded by ledgers and account books, Clara had felt something she'd never confessed to another living soul: relief. Then came the shame for feeling it. Then came his family. Edmund's brother Lawrence and his cold-eyed wife Margaret had descended on the household within days, their mourning clothes pristine, their intentions clear. Clara was an embarrassment now, a childless widow of 30 with no fortune of her own, no family connections worth preserving. They'd made sympathetic sounds while inventorying Edmund's possessions, made concerned observations about her withdrawn state, her pale complexion, her inability to eat. What Clara needs, Lawrence had announced over dinner one evening, is a complete change of scenery, a purpose, something to occupy her mind while she heals from this tragedy. That's how she'd found herself accepting a teaching position in a one-room schoolhouse in Ironwood, Montana Territory, a place so remote it barely appeared on maps. Lawrence had arranged everything with remarkable efficiency. The position came with room and board, a modest salary, and most importantly for the Whitmores, it came with 3,000 miles between Clara and Boston society. "You'll recover your spirits in the frontier air," Margaret had said, not quite meeting Clara's eyes. "And when you're ready to return to civilization, we'll discuss your future then." The unspoken message was clear: go away until we decide what to do with you. Clara had agreed, because the alternative was staying in Edmund's house. Now Lawrence's house, being grateful for their charity and slowly disappearing into the wallpaper. At least Montana promised space, distance, perhaps, though she barely let herself think it, freedom. The journey had taken 3 weeks, trains to Chicago, then St. Paul, then a succession of smaller rail lines until the tracks simply ended and the real West began. The final leg was a 2-day wagon ride with a hired driver named Jensen, a weathered man of 50 who spoke little and spit tobacco with practiced aim. Clara had never seen country like this. The Montana Territory spread out in all directions, endless and raw and beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Rolling plains gave way to distant mountains that scraped the sky, their peaks already white with early winter snow. The air carried a cold, clean bite that seemed to cut through the layers of her proper traveling clothes. A heavy wool dress in morning black, a thick cloak, gloves, a hat pinned securely to her carefully arranged hair. She felt ridiculous dressed like this against such wildness. Felt small and fragile and utterly out of place. "Storm coming," Jensen had said that final morning, eyeing the northern sky with clear concern. "Bad one, looks like. We should have reached Ironwood by now, but that axle delay yesterday put us behind." The wagon had thrown a wheel the previous afternoon, cost them 4 hours, while Jensen made repairs with materials that seemed barely adequate. Now they were on an empty trail with heavy grey clouds building on the horizon like a wall, and Jensen's weathered face had gone tight with worry. "How much farther?" Clara asked, pulling her cloak tighter against the rising wind. "Another 8 miles, maybe 10. If we push hard and the weather holds, we might make it before dark." But the weather didn't hold. The storm came down from the mountains like God's own judgment, just as the sun began its descent toward the western peaks. First came the wind, bitter and fierce, driving through Clara's layers of clothing as though they were paper. Then came the snow, not the gentle flakes she remembered from Boston winters, but hard, stinging crystals that blew horizontal. Turning the world white in minutes, Jensen urged the horses faster, but Clara could see the fear in the set of his shoulders, the way he kept glancing at the darkening sky. The trail became harder to follow, the familiar landmarks disappearing into the swirling white. The temperature dropped so quickly, Clara's breath came in visible clouds, her fingers going numb despite her gloves. Then came the crack, sharp and final as a gunshot. The wagon lurched violently to one side, throwing Clara against the wooden seat. Jensen swore, fighting the reins as the horses screamed and stamped. When they finally stopped, tilted at a dangerous angle, Clara could see the problem. The rear axle, weakened by yesterday's hasty repair, had snapped completely. "Can you fix it?" Clara asked, though she already knew the answer from Jensen's expression. "Not out here. Not in this." He looked around at the whiteout conditions, the failing light. "Miss Whitmore, I need to ride ahead for help. Get to Ironwood, bring back tools and another wagon." "Leave me here?" Clara's voice came out smaller than she intended. "You stay with the wagon. Stay wrapped in these blankets. I'll be back before midnight with help, I swear it." He was already unhitching one of the horses, moving with urgent efficiency. "You got those matches? Keep that hand warmer lit. Jensen, miss, I got no choice. You stay put, you hear? Don't wander off the trail. I'll be back." Then he was gone, swallowed by the storm, and Clara was alone. She'd tried to do as he said. Wrapped herself in every blanket from the wagon bed, huddled in the tilted seat, struck match after match to keep the small hand warmer burning. But as the light faded and the cold deepened, as the hours passed with no sign of Jensen's return, Clara understood with growing certainty that she was going to die out here. The cold was unlike anything she'd ever experienced. It crept through the blankets, through her clothes, through her skin, until it felt like it was freezing her from the inside out. Her feet went numb first, then her hands. Her face burned with cold, then stopped feeling anything at all. When full darkness came and Jensen still hadn't returned, Clara made a decision. She couldn't just sit here and freeze. The town had to be ahead somewhere on this trail. If she walked, kept moving, maybe she'd generate enough warmth to survive. Maybe she'd find shelter. Maybe someone would find her. It was a desperate plan, probably foolish. But staying in the wagon felt like choosing death. She abandoned the blankets, too heavy, too cumbersome, and stumbled down from the broken wagon onto the snow-covered trail. The wind nearly knocked her over immediately. She couldn't see more than a few feet in any direction. Couldn't tell earth from sky in the swirling white, but she walked, one foot in front of the other, following what she hoped was the trail, praying with every breath for a miracle she had no right to expect. She didn't know how long she walked. Time became meaningless in the white void, marked only by her failing steps and the growing certainty that she'd made a terrible mistake. Her feet were blocks of ice in her boots. Her hands had lost all feeling. Her face burned and then went mercifully numb. "This is how I die," she thought with strange clarity. Not in Edmund's house as his proper widow, but lost in a Montana blizzard, frozen and alone. Perhaps that's more honest than the life I was living. She stumbled, fell to her knees in the deep snow, struggled to rise and couldn't find the strength. The wind screamed around her. The cold pressed down like a weight, and Clara Whitmore, who'd never really lived the life she wanted, prepared to stop living at all. That's when she saw him. At first, she thought he was a hallucination, a dark shape materializing from the white storm like a ghost from another age. A man on horseback, massive and weathered, wrapped in a heavy cloak with snow gathering in his dark beard. His horse was huge, steam rising from its flanks, and the man sat so still he might have been carved from the mountain itself. Clara tried to speak, but her frozen lips wouldn't form words. She managed only a broken whisper. "Please, I'm lost. I can't." The man looked down at her with eyes that held something she couldn't name. Recognition, perhaps, or memory, or simply the acknowledgement of one living soul seeing another on the edge of death. When he spoke, his voice was low and rough from disuse, but steady as stone. "Follow me home," 3 words. That's all he offered. No questions about who she was or how she'd come to be dying in a blizzard. No reassurances or explanations. Just those 3 words and an outstretched hand, gloved and scarred and surprisingly gentle as it reached down toward her. Clara Whitmore, who'd spent her entire life being told what to do, who'd followed every rule and met every expectation and suffocated under the weight of other people's choices, looked up at this stranger through the storm and made perhaps the first real decision of her life. She took his hand. The world narrowed to the rhythm of the horse's gait and the solid warmth of the man behind her. Eli, she didn't know his name yet, only that he'd pulled her up onto his horse with surprising gentleness and wrapped his heavy cloak around them both before turning the animal into the teeth of the storm. Clara drifted in and out of awareness, her body shutting down from the cold, even as his presence kept the worst of death at bay. She had impressions more than memories, the steady beat of his heart against her back, the low murmur of his voice speaking to the horse, the way his arms formed a shelter around her as they climbed higher into the hills. She didn't know how long they rode. The storm raged around them, but he seemed to navigate by instinct, following paths invisible in the white chaos. Once she felt the horse stumble and his arms tightened protectively. Another time she heard him speak, not to her, but to himself or perhaps to God. Not again. Not this time. When they finally stopped, Clara was too far gone to register much beyond the blessed cessation of movement and wind. She felt herself being lifted down, carried, heard the creak of a door, and then suddenly there was warmth, real warmth. The shock of it so intense it hurt. "Easy now," the man's voice said, low and careful. "You're safe. I've got you." He laid her on something soft near a fire, and Clara's body began the painful process of thawing. Her hands and feet burned as sensation returned. Her face stung. Her lungs ached with each breath of warm air. She wanted to curl into a ball against the pain. But his hands were already working, removing her frozen boots with practiced efficiency, examining her feet with gentle fingers. "Frostbite, but not too deep," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "You're lucky. Lucky." Clara would have laughed if she'd had the strength. She drifted again, consciousness coming and going like a tide. When she surfaced, he was wrapping her feet in soft cloth, then covering her with heavy blankets that smelled of wood smoke and leather. The fire crackled nearby, and she could see rough timber walls, a low ceiling with exposed beams, sparse furnishings that spoke of solitary living. "Where?" she managed, her voice a broken rasp. "My cabin. About 7 miles north of where I found you." He moved away, returned with a cup of something warm. "Drink this slowly." He helped her sit up enough to sip. It was broth, simple, salty, hot, and it might have been the most delicious thing Clara had ever tasted. She managed a few swallows before exhaustion pulled her down again. When she woke next, it was fully night. The storm still howled outside, but the cabin was an island of warmth and safety. Clara took stock of her surroundings more clearly now. One large room, maybe 20 feet square. A fireplace built from river stone dominated one wall. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs. Shelves holding supplies, tools, a few battered books. A narrow bed in the corner, the bed she was lying in. Everything was simple, functional, clean. The home of a man who lived alone, and lived deliberately. The man himself sat by the fire, his back to her, shoulders broad under a worn flannel shirt. His hair was dark, touched with grey at the temples, longer than was fashionable. When he turned, sensing her movement, Clara got her first real look at his face. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps 45, maybe 50. His face was weathered by sun and wind, lined around the eyes and mouth in ways that spoke of both hardship and laughter, though she suspected the latter was a distant memory. His beard was neatly trimmed, despite the remoteness of his life. But it was his eyes that caught her, dark brown, almost black, and carrying a weight of sorrow that Clara recognized because she'd seen something similar in her own mirror. "How long?" she asked, "since I brought you in?" "About 4 hours." "Storm's still raging. Won't break until morning, most likely." He rose, moved toward her with a grace surprising in such a large man. "How do you feel?" "Like I died and came back." Clara tried to sit up fully, winced at the burning in her feet and hands. "Don't push it. You need rest, warmth, time." He handed her more broth from a pot hanging over the fire. "I'm Eli McCord, Clara Whitmore." She accepted the cup, managed to hold it herself this time. "Thank you for saving my life, Mr. McCord. Just Eli." He settled back into his chair, maintaining a respectful distance. "What were you doing out there?" Clara told him the story, the broken wagon, Jensen's departure, her decision to walk rather than freeze. As she spoke, Eli's expression grew darker. "Damn fool thing to do, leaving you like that," he said when she finished. "Storm like this, he should have known better. Should have kept you both with the wagon, built a shelter, waited it out. He was trying to help. He was panicking." Eli's voice held no judgment, only fact. "Panic kills out here. You kept your head at least. Followed the trail, didn't wander off into the wilderness. That's probably what saved you. That and you." He looked away at that, something crossing his face. Pain, perhaps, or memory. "I was checking my trap line before the storm got too bad. Saw your wagon earlier, broken down. Figured Jensen would handle it, but something told me to check the trail again." He paused. "Or maybe someone told me. My Sarah used to say I was too stubborn to listen to the voice of God, but that night—" He stopped, shook his head. "Doesn't matter. Point is, I found you, Sarah." Clara asked gently. Though she knew she was treading on private ground, Eli's eyes went to the mantel above the fireplace, where Clara now noticed a woman's hair comb, delicate silver filigree, worn smooth with age and handling. Beside it, hanging from a leather cord, was a wedding ring, my wife. She died 5 years ago. Storm like this one. His voice was carefully neutral, each word placed with precision to keep emotion at bay. "I was out hunting, gone 3 days. When I got back, I found her on the trail not far from here. She'd been visiting a neighbor, tried to make it home when the weather turned. He stopped, jaw working. "I was too late." The pain in those last words was so raw that Clara felt it like a physical thing. She understood then why he lived alone up here, why locals called him a ghost. He'd been running from that moment for 5 years, hiding in the wilderness from a world that had taken everything from him. "I'm sorry," she said, knowing the words were insufficient, but offering them anyway. "Long time ago." But the way he said it made clear it was yesterday, would always be yesterday. "Point is, you need to stay here until the storm breaks, and you're strong enough to travel. I'll take you into Ironwood once the weather clears. They'll have found your wagon by then, gotten word to your people." "I don't have people," Clara said before she could stop herself. "Not really." Eli looked at her more carefully then, and she saw recognition in his eyes, the acknowledgement of someone who understood loss and loneliness. "Well," he said finally, "you've got shelter tonight. That's something." The storm raged for 3 more days. Clara spent those days recovering her strength, learning the rhythms of Eli's solitary life, and trying not to feel like an intruder in his carefully constructed exile. He'd given her his bed, refused her protests, and slept by the fire wrapped in blankets. He was unfailingly courteous, almost formal, maintaining a distance that was clearly practiced, but there were moments, small, unguarded moments, when the isolation cracked and Clara glimpsed the man beneath, like when she caught him reading one of his few books, lips moving slowly with the words, and realized he struggled with literacy, or when he prepared meals with an unconscious care that spoke of someone who'd once cooked for more than himself, or late at night, when he thought she was asleep, and she heard him talking softly to the photograph he kept in a drawer. A young woman with kind eyes and a bright smile. The Sarah he'd loved and lost. Clara learned the basics of his life through observation and brief conversations. He'd been married for 10 years, had built this cabin with his own hands as a refuge for them both. He'd worked as a guide and trapper, knew these mountains better than any man living. After Sarah died, he'd withdrawn completely, avoiding town except for the most necessary trips to trade furs for supplies. "Folks think I'm strange," he said one evening as they shared a simple dinner of beans and cornbread. "Talk about me like I'm some kind of hermit." "Maybe I am. Or maybe you're just someone who got hurt and needed time to heal," Clara offered. Eli looked at her with those sorrowful eyes. 5 years is a long time to heal. Maybe healing isn't about time. Maybe it's about finding a reason to try. He didn't answer, but something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor he'd built so carefully around himself. On the 3rd night, unable to sleep, Clara sat up and looked around the cabin that had become her sanctuary. Everything here spoke of a life interrupted, frozen in place by grief. Sarah's comb on the mantel, her apron still hanging by the door, a half-finished knitting project in a basket that no one had touched in 5 years. Eli was outside checking on his horse, and Clara found herself drawn to the mantel. She looked at the comb, fought the urge to touch it. She'd want someone to use it, Eli's voice said from the doorway, making her jump. "Sarah, I mean... She always said her things were meant for living, not for keeping like museum pieces. I didn't mean to pry. You weren't." He moved into the room, stood beside her, looking at the comb. "I keep them there because, I don't know, because moving them feels like losing her all over again. Foolish, probably. Not foolish. Human." They stood in silence for a long moment, 2 wounded people finding unexpected companionship in shared grief. "The storm's breaking," Eli said finally. "Come morning, I'll take you to Ironwood. Get you settled at the schoolhouse, make sure you're safe." "Yes, of course." Clara felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. She'd be leaving this quiet sanctuary, this man who'd saved her life, and asked nothing in return. Back to the world of expectations and obligations, to the teaching position she'd accepted as an escape that now felt like just another cage. Clara. It was the first time he'd used her given name. "When we get to town, if you need anything, supplies, help with anything, you can send word. I check the trading post once a month." It was a small offering, but from a man who'd isolated himself for 5 years, it meant something. "Thank you." Eli for everything. He nodded, looked away, and Clara understood that he was already rebuilding his walls, preparing to return to his solitude once his duty to her was done. But as she lay in his bed that last night, listening to the wind finally dying outside, Clara realized something that both terrified and exhilarated her. She didn't want to leave. For the first time since Edmund's death, perhaps for the first time in her entire adult life, she felt like she could breathe. This rough cabin, this silent man, this harsh, beautiful wilderness felt more like home than anywhere she'd ever lived. The question was whether she had the courage to stay. January brought cold that cut like a knife and snow that piled higher than Clara had imagined possible. The schoolhouse required constant tending, wood stoves stoked every hour, paths shoveled daily, drafts plugged with whatever material she could find. Several times the weather was so severe that Clara had to cancel lessons, and she found herself missing her students' energy almost as much as she missed her Saturday afternoons with Eli. He came when he could, which wasn't always every week. Twice he sent word through Garrett that the mountain passes were impassable. Once he arrived 3 days late, snow-crusted and half-frozen, explaining he'd been trapped by a sudden storm and had to wait it out in a line shack. "You shouldn't risk yourself for reading lessons," Clara scolded. Helping him thaw by the schoolhouse stove. "Wasn't just for the lessons," he said, then looked away quickly, as if he'd revealed too much. These slips were becoming more frequent. The way his eyes would linger on her face, how he'd position himself near her, close enough that she could feel his warmth. The careful way he'd say her name, like it was something precious. And Clara, despite her resolution to be content with friendship, found herself responding, leaning closer than necessary when pointing out words on a page, letting her hand rest on his arm a moment longer than needed, finding excuses to touch his shoulder, his hand, to feel the solid reality of him. They were dancing around something neither could quite name, and it was both thrilling and terrifying. The shift came on a Saturday in late January when Eli arrived with an unexpected proposal. "My traplines need checking," he said after their lesson. 3-day circuit through the high country. I'm running low on supplies, need to make a good catch before the trading post run." He paused, not quite meeting her eyes. "Thought you might want to come along. Learn the country, see how it's done." Clara's heart leaped. 3 days? In the wilderness? I'd keep you safe. There's line shacks, rough shelters at intervals. Nothing fancy, but warm and dry. He finally looked at her directly. "But I'd understand if it's not proper. You being the school teacher and all, proper. That word again." Clara had spent her entire life being proper, and where had it gotten her? "When do we leave?" The surprise and pleasure that crossed Eli's face was worth any risk to her reputation. They set out before dawn on Monday, riding double on Eli's big gelding, their supplies packed on a mule Eli had borrowed from Garrett. The town was barely stirring, though Clara saw Mrs. Patterson's curtain twitch as they passed. Let her gossip, Clara thought. For once, she didn't care. The journey into the high country was like entering another world. Eli took trails that seemed invisible to Clara's eyes, navigating by landmarks only he could read. A lightning-struck pine, a particular rock formation, the way the wind had shaped the snow. He talked more than she'd ever heard him talk, pointing out animal tracks, explaining how to read the weather in the clouds, showing her which plants stayed green beneath the snow and could be used for medicine or food. "Sarah taught me some of this," he said, as they paused to let the horse rest. "But most I learned from an old crow trapper named Two Rivers. He'd lived in these mountains 60 years, knew every creek and canyon. Said the land would teach you everything you needed to know if you learned to listen. Do you listen?" "I try. These mountains, they kept me alive after Sarah died. Gave me purpose when I didn't have any other reason to keep going." He looked out over the vast white landscape. "Probably sound foolish to you, a city woman." "Not foolish at all. I think I understand." Clara dismounted carefully, stretching her stiff legs. "The wilderness has a peace to it, our honesty. It doesn't pretend to be anything but what it is." Eli studied her with something like wonder. "That's exactly right. Sarah used to say the same thing, that she felt more herself out here than anywhere in the world of men." They reached the first trapline by early afternoon. Eli showed Clara how to approach carefully, how to read signs of animals in the area, how to reset traps efficiently. They'd caught 2 rabbits and a fox, and Eli dispatched the fox quickly and humanely, then showed Clara how to prepare the pelt. "Every part gets used," he explained as he worked. "Meat for food, fur for trade, even the bones have purpose. It's respect, taking only what you need and wasting nothing." Clara watched his capable hands, the reverence with which he treated the animal, and understood that this was more than survival to him. It was a way of life, a philosophy made practical. That night they stayed in a line shack, barely more than 4 walls and a roof, with a stone fire pit and a pile of cut wood left from previous visits. Eli built up the fire while Clara unpacked their supplies. They prepared a simple meal of beans and the rabbit meat, and as they ate, Clara realized she was completely happy. Not the giddy happiness of new romance, or the satisfied happiness of meeting expectations, but the deep, settled happiness of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly who she wanted to be with. "Eli," she said suddenly, "thank you for bringing me here." He looked up from his plate. "You're doing well out here, better than most city folk would. You've got an instinct for the wild. It doesn't feel wild to me. It feels like," she struggled for the right words, "like coming home." Something shifted in Eli's expression. The firelight played across his weathered face, softening the hard lines. And Clara saw clearly the man he must have been before grief carved him hollow, strong and vital and fully alive. "Clara," he said slowly, carefully, "these past few months, having you around, the lessons, the talking, it's been He stopped, started again. I told myself I was just helping you settle in, repaying the debt of saving your life by giving you some company. But that's not true anymore, if it ever was. Clara's breath caught. What is it, then? I don't know how to say it. Don't have the fancy words. He set down his plate, leaned forward, his eyes intense on hers. But when you're not there on Saturdays, the whole week feels wrong. When I'm up here alone, I catch myself thinking what you'd say about the sunset, or how you'd laugh at the way that raven's scolding me. And today, bringing you out here, his voice roughened. This is my place, the heart of my world, and I wanted you to see it. Wanted you to be part of it. I want that too, Clara whispered. I've wanted it since those 3 days in your cabin, maybe before. I've been so afraid to say it because you made it clear you weren't looking for— I was a fool, Eli interrupted. Told myself I couldn't love again, that I didn't deserve it after failing Sarah. But Clara, what I feel for you— He reached across the small space between them, took her hand. It's not the same as what I had with Sarah. It's different, but it's real, and it's strong, and I'm tired of pretending it isn't there. What are you saying? I'm saying I love you. I'm saying I want you to stay, not in town, not in that boarding house, but with me. Here in these mountains, in my cabin. His grip on her hand tightened. I'm saying I want to spend whatever years I've got left making you happy. If you'll have a rough mountain man who can barely read and talks to horses. Tears spilled down Clara's cheeks, tears of joy so pure it hurt. Yes, God, yes. He pulled her to him then, and their kiss was tentative at first, then deepening, years of loneliness and grief melting away in the warmth of newfound love. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Eli pressed his forehead to hers. We'll do it right, he said. Proper marriage before God and the town. I won't have anyone saying I dishonored you. Clara laughed through her tears. Propriety again. Some rules are worth keeping. They held each other through the night, talking of plans and possibilities of the life they would build together. And outside, the winter stars wheeled overhead, cold and distant and beautiful, witnesses to a love neither had expected, but both desperately needed. They returned to Ironwood 3 days later, and Clara knew immediately that the town was different. Or perhaps she was different. No longer trying to fit into the mold of proper widowed schoolteacher, but a woman in love, planning a future on her own terms. Mrs. Patterson's disapproval was palpable when Clara asked to settle her account and move her belongings. You're leaving. But the school term— I'll finish the term, Clara assured her. But then I'll be getting married and moving to my husband's home. The older woman's eyes widened. Married to whom? Eli McCord. The shocked silence was almost comical. Then that hermit. Mrs. Whitmore, surely you can't be serious. The man lives like an animal up in those hills. He has no education, no prospects, He has everything I want, Clara said firmly. And I'd appreciate it if you'd keep a civil tongue when speaking of my intended husband. The gossip spread through town like wildfire. Some people were scandalized. A respectable widow throwing herself away on a mountain recluse. Others were pragmatic. Clara was a grown woman, and Eli McCord, whatever his oddities, was known to be honest and hard-working. A few, like Garrett at the trading post and Reverend Mills, seemed genuinely pleased. About time Eli came out of his cave, Garrett said with a grin. Man's been half dead for 5 years. You're good for him, Mrs. Whitmore. Please call me Clara, and I hope I am. He's good for you too, I reckon. You've got color in your cheeks now, life in your eyes. Wasn't there when you first arrived. Reverend Mills agreed to perform the ceremony in late March, after the school term ended and the worst of winter had passed. Though if you'd like to wait until summer, he offered gently, have a proper wedding with guests and— No, Clara said. March is perfect. We don't need anything elaborate. Just the vows and God's blessing, but planning even a simple wedding in a frontier town while teaching full-time proved challenging. Clara found herself grateful for the Saturday lessons with Eli, which became planning sessions as much as reading practice. Do we need flowers? Eli asked one afternoon, puzzling over a list Clara had made. I'd like some. Nothing fancy, whatever's blooming in the hills by then. I can manage that. He made a careful note in his improving handwriting. And you're sure about this? Moving up to the cabin? It's rough living, Clara. No neighbors for miles, harsh winters, isolation. I'm sure. She covered his hand with hers. Eli, those 3 days on the trapline were the happiest I've been in years, maybe ever. That's the life I want. He turned his hand palm up, lacing his fingers with hers. You'll get lonely sometimes. Wonder what you gave up. Will you? Me? No. I'll wake up every day amazed you chose me. His eyes held that vulnerability she'd come to cherish. But you're giving up more. The town, society, your teaching. I'm giving up nothing that matters and gaining everything that does. Still, Clara had moments of doubt. Not about Eli or her love for him, but about practical realities. Could she truly adapt to such an isolated life? What about the stimulation of teaching, of conversation, of culture? Would she resent him eventually for the limitations of their life? She voiced these fears to Reverend Mills during one of their meetings about the ceremony. Cold feet are natural, he said kindly. But Mrs. Whitmore, Clara, may I be frank? Please. I've been minister in this town for 15 years. I've married dozens of couples, buried friends, counseled the troubled, and I can tell you this. The marriages that last aren't the ones built on convenience or social standing or even grand passion. They're the ones built on friendship, respect, and a genuine desire to make each other's lives better. He smiled. You and Eli have that. I see it in how you speak of him, how he looks at you. That's more solid than all the society dinners and cultural events in the world. His words settled Clara's doubts. She threw herself into preparing, finishing lesson plans for her replacement, organizing her books and possessions, learning from Eli the practical skills she'd need. He taught her to shoot, which scandalized half the town when she practiced behind the schoolhouse. He showed her how to preserve food, repair tools, read weather signs. And in turn, she taught him not just reading, but the joy of poetry. The pleasure of ideas discussed and debated. Listen to this, she said one Saturday, reading from Whitman. I exist as I am. That is enough. Do you think that's true? That simply existing, being yourself, is sufficient. Eli considered, his brow furrowed in thought. For some folks, maybe, but I think existing isn't enough unless you're truly alive, unless you're living honest, connecting with others, finding purpose. He met her eyes. I existed for 5 years after Sarah died, but I wasn't living. Not until you. These conversations, these moments of intellectual and emotional intimacy, convinced Clara she would never be bored or lonely with this man. In early March, 2 events occurred that would test their happiness. First, Clara received a letter forwarded from Boston from Lawrence Whitmore. Edmund's brother had finally learned of her plans to remain in Montana, and his response was predictable: shock, disapproval, and thinly veiled threats about family obligations and inheritance. He says, if I insist on this reckless course, I'll be cut off from the family entirely, Clara told Eli, her voice trembling with anger more than fear. As if I wanted anything to do with them. Is there money involved? Inheritance you'd be losing? Some, a small trust Edmund left. Lawrence controls it. She looked at Eli. Does it matter? Would you think less of me for giving up money to be with you? Clara, I'd think less of you if you stayed for the money. He took the letter, scanned it, his jaw tightening. But I need you to be sure. Mountain life is hard. We'll have enough to live on, but there won't be luxuries. No fancy dresses or, I don't want fancy dresses. I want you. She took the letter back, walked to the wood stove and fed it to the flames without hesitation. Their decision made, the second event was more troubling. Jensen, the driver who'd abandoned Clara in the storm, returned to town. He'd been recovering in a settlement 30 miles west, and when he learned Clara had survived and was planning to marry Eli McCord, he became vocal in his opinions. That man's not right, he told anyone who'd listen at the saloon. Living up there alone all those years, talking to himself, wild as the animals he traps. Mrs. Whitmore don't know what she's getting into. Someone should stop her before she makes a terrible mistake. The gossip reached Clara through her students, and she felt fury rise in her chest. She found Jensen at the saloon and confronted him publicly. "Mr. Jensen, you abandoned me to die in a blizzard. Eli McCord saved my life. So forgive me if I don't value your opinion on his character." The saloon went silent. Jensen's face reddened. "I was getting help. You were saving yourself and hoping someone else would deal with the problem." Eli rode into a killing storm because he couldn't leave another human being to freeze. "That's the difference between you." She turned and walked out with her head high, aware she'd just burned another bridge with propriety. But she didn't care. Let them talk. In 2 weeks she'd be Mrs. Eli McCord, and the opinion of small-minded gossips would matter even less than it did. Now, the wedding was set for the last Saturday in March. Clara had given notice that she'd finish the school term but wouldn't return in the fall. A replacement teacher had been found, a young man from Helena who seemed eager for frontier adventure. Everything was falling into place. Then, on the Tuesday before the wedding, a rider arrived in Ironwood with mail from the east. Garrett brought the letter to Clara at the schoolhouse himself, his expression troubled. "This came for you. Looks official, fancy paper, Boston postmark." Clara's hands trembled as she opened it. The letter was from a law firm, Hastings and Porter, written in formal legal language that made her heart sink with each line. "Dear Mrs. Whitmore, we represent the interests of the Whitmore family estate. It has come to our attention that you intend to remarry and permanently relocate to Montana Territory. While we congratulate you on finding companionship, we must inform you of certain legal complications arising from your late husband's will. As executor of Edmund Whitmore's estate, his brother Lawrence has discovered a codicil to the will that stipulates specific conditions regarding your inheritance. Should you remarry within 2 years of Mr. Whitmore's death, and should your new husband be deemed of insufficient social and financial standing, the trust established for your benefit will be dissolved and returned to the primary Whitmore estate. Furthermore, Mr. Lawrence Whitmore, acting in what he believes to be your best interests, has expressed serious concerns about your mental and emotional state. He contends that recent hardships, specifically your ordeal in the Montana wilderness, may have impaired your judgment. To that end, he is prepared to travel to Montana Territory with medical and legal support to assess your competency and, if necessary, arrange for your return to Boston, where you can receive proper care. We expect Mr. Whitmore and his party to arrive in Ironwood within 2 weeks. We strongly advise you to postpone any matrimonial plans until this matter can be properly resolved." The letter went on, but Clara couldn't read further. Her vision blurred, her breath came short. Lawrence was coming. He was going to try to drag her back to Boston, claim she was unfit, use the law to control her just as Edmund had. "Clara." Garrett's voice seemed to come from far away. "You all right? You've gone pale as milk." She thrust the letter at him, unable to speak. As he read, his expression darkened from concern to fury. "This is horseshit, pardon my language. They can't just declare you incompetent because you want to marry a man they don't approve of, can't they?" Clara's voice was hollow. "Lawrence has money, connections, lawyers. What do I have? I'm a woman alone, making choices that seem strange to people who don't know me. All he needs is one judge who agrees I'm not thinking clearly. Then we get Eli. He'll know what to do." But when they found Eli at his camp on the edge of town, his reaction was worse than Clara feared. He listened to the letter in silence, his face growing harder with each sentence. When Garrett finished reading, Eli stood abruptly and walked away, his back rigid with tension. "Eli," Clara followed him. "Say something. What's there to say? Your family's coming to take you back. They've got the law on their side, money, position." His voice was flat, emotionless, the same tone he'd used that first night in his cabin, walls up, guarding himself against pain. "You should probably go with them." "What?" Clara felt like he'd struck her. "I'm not going anywhere. We're getting married on Saturday." "Are we?" He turned, and the look in his eyes broke her heart. "Clara, be realistic. They'll drag you through legal proceedings, question your sanity, make your life hell. And why? Because you want to marry a mountain hermit with no education, no prospects, no standing in society. Maybe, he swallowed hard, maybe they're right. Maybe you are making a mistake. Don't you dare, Clara said, fury rising through her shock. Don't you dare use their words. You told me yourself I was brave and strong and capable of choosing my own life. Was that a lie? No, but what? But you're scared. But it's easier to push me away than to fight for us. She stepped closer, forced him to meet her eyes. I love you, Eli. I choose you. But I need to know you choose me too, not just in the easy moments, but when it's hard, when people judge us, when we have to stand together against the world. You don't understand. His voice cracked. Sarah died because of me, because I wasn't there, wasn't protecting her. If I let you tie yourself to me, to this life, and something happens, if they take you away or hurt you, or I can't lose someone else. Clara, I can't survive it again. And there it was, the heart of his fear laid bare. Clara felt her anger drain away, replaced by aching compassion. Oh, Eli. She took his hands, held them tight. You didn't fail, Sarah. A storm killed her, not you. And you can't protect me from everything. That's not how love works. But you can trust me to be strong enough to face whatever comes. Trust us to be strong enough together. For a long moment he stood frozen, warring with himself. Then slowly his fingers tightened on hers. I'm terrified, he whispered. So am I. But I'd rather be terrified with you than safe without you. He pulled her into his arms then, holding her like she might disappear if he let go. We'll fight them, he said against her hair. Whatever it takes. I'm not letting them take you. They spent the next days preparing. Reverend Mills agreed to move the wedding up. They'd marry that very Saturday, before Lawrence could arrive and complicate things. Garrett spread word among the townspeople, and Clara was surprised by how many expressed support. Dr. Brennan, the town's physician, offered to provide a written assessment of Clara's mental state, perfectly sound. Rational and competent, his letter stated firmly. Even Mrs. Patterson, who'd been so disapproving, admitted that Clara seemed happier and healthier than when she'd arrived. You've bloomed out here, the older woman said grudgingly. And if Eli McCord makes you happy, well, who am I to judge? The wedding took place in the small church with perhaps 20 people in attendance. Clara wore a simple dress borrowed from the minister's wife, carried wildflowers that Eli had gathered from the first spring blooms in the hills. Eli stood at the altar in his best clothes, still rough by Boston standards, but clean and carefully mended. And when he saw Clara walking toward him, his eyes filled with tears. Dearly beloved, Reverend Mills began, and Clara felt peace settle over her. This was right. This was real. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. They'd just spoken their vows. Just been pronounced husband and wife, just shared their first kiss as a married couple. When the church doors burst open, Lawrence Whitmore stood in the doorway, his wife Margaret beside him, a hired man behind them carrying bags. His face was red with fury and exertion. They'd clearly ridden hard to reach Ironwood. Stop this immediately, Lawrence commanded. That woman is not of sound mind and cannot legally consent to marriage. The church went silent. Clara felt Eli tense beside her, but she stepped forward calmly. I'm afraid you're too late, Lawrence. We're already married. That ceremony means nothing if you're incompetent to consent. He pushed into the church, thrusting papers at Reverend Mills. I have medical documents here, affidavits about her recent trauma and questionable decisions, from doctors who have never examined her, Dr. Brennan said, standing up from his pew. I'm the physician in this town, and I've assessed Mrs. McCord, he emphasized the new name, thoroughly. She is perfectly sane, rational, and capable of making her own decisions. You're a frontier quack, Margaret sneered. Barely qualified to treat horses, much less make psychiatric assessments. I studied at Harvard Medical School, Mrs. Whitmore. My credentials are impeccable. Dr. Brennan's voice was ice. Can you say the same for these doctors you've brought? Because I notice these affidavits are dated before Mrs. McCord's supposed trauma, almost as if they were prepared in advance to serve your purposes, regardless of the truth. Lawrence's face went darker. This is preposterous. Clara, I'm trying to save you from making the worst mistake of your life. This man, he gestured dismissively at Eli, is completely unsuitable. He lives like an animal, has no prospects, no education. He has integrity, kindness, and the courage to let me be myself. Clara's voice rang clear through the church. Which is more than I can say for anyone in the Whitmore family. You're throwing away your security, your future, your place in society. I'm choosing my life instead of the one you'd force on me. I'm choosing love instead of obligation. And I'm choosing to be happy instead of acceptable. Clara took Eli's hand, felt his strength flowing into her. The ceremony is complete. The marriage is legal. And I'm asking you, for the last time, to respect my decision and leave me in peace. I will not stand by and watch you destroy yourself, Lawrence said coldly. If you won't see reason, I'll have no choice but to pursue legal action. I'll have this marriage annulled. I'll have you declared incompetent. You'll leave my wife alone, Eli said quietly. But there was steel in his voice, and something in his eyes made Lawrence step back involuntarily. She's made her choice clear. The law's been followed. We're married before God and witnesses. You've got no grounds to interfere, and if you try, you'll find I'm not as easy to push around as you think. Are you threatening me? I'm stating fact. Clara's my wife now, under my protection. And I don't take kindly to folks who try to hurt what's mine. Eli's hand moved to rest on the knife at his belt. Not a threat, just a reminder of who and what he was. Now you and your wife can leave peaceful-like, or we can discuss this outside. Your choice. The church held its breath. Lawrence looked around at the townspeople, all watching with varying degrees of hostility. He looked at Clara, standing firm beside her mountain man husband. He looked at the documents in his hand, suddenly useless in the face of accomplished fact. This isn't over, he said finally. You'll regret this, Clara. When you're stuck in that hovel in the wilderness, when you realize what you've given up. The only thing I regret, Clara said clearly, is wasting 8 years pretending to be happy with Edmund. I won't make that mistake again. Lawrence turned and stalked out, Margaret hurrying after him with one last venomous look at Clara. The hired man followed, and the church doors slammed shut behind them. For a moment, no one moved. Then Garrett started clapping, and slowly the other townspeople joined in, applause mixed with nervous laughter. Relief that the confrontation had ended without violence. Clara turned to Eli, saw the worry still etched in his face despite their victory. It's all right, she said softly. He's gone. We're married. Nothing can change that. He'll try, Eli said. Men like that don't give up easy. Then we'll face it together. That's what marriage means, isn't it? Eli pulled her close, and in front of God and the gathered townspeople, kissed his wife with a tenderness that made several people dab at their eyes. Together, he agreed. Whatever comes. They spent their wedding night at the cabin, Clara's first time returning since those 3 days after the storm, and now as Eli's wife. Everything looked the same yet completely different. The rough timber walls that had seemed strange and forbidding now felt welcoming. The single room that had seemed so sparse now seemed cozy. This was home now, truly home, in a way nowhere else had ever been. Eli was nervous, she realized, with tender amusement. This strong, capable man who could survive alone in the wilderness was anxious about his wedding night. He kept busying himself with unnecessary tasks, stoking the fire that was already burning fine, checking supplies that didn't need checking. Adjusting things that didn't need adjusting. Eli, Clara said finally, catching his hand. Come here. He came to her, and in the firelight she saw vulnerability in his eyes that made her heart ache. I haven't been with anyone since Sarah. 5 years is a long time, and I'm not sure I remember. He stopped, frustrated with himself. I don't want to disappoint you. You couldn't possibly. Clara cupped his weathered face in her hands. We have all the time in the world to learn each other. There's no rush, no expectations, just us. And so they learned each other slowly, tenderly, with patience and growing joy. Clara discovered the scars on his body, some from work, some from the wilderness, each with a story. He discovered the ticklish spot behind her knee, the way she sighed when he kissed her throat, the softness of her skin beneath the practical clothes. They loved each other with a sweetness born of long loneliness finally ended. And afterward, wrapped in each other's arms beneath heavy quilts, both felt a peace neither had known in years. "I love you," Eli whispered into her hair. "Didn't think I'd ever say those words again. Didn't think I deserved to. You deserve every happiness, Eli McCord." "And so do I. That's what we're giving each other, permission to be happy." They drifted to sleep in each other's arms, content despite the shadow of Lawrence's threat hanging over them. The next week fell into a rhythm that felt both strange and natural. Clara had given up her teaching position, finished her commitments to the town, and now devoted herself to learning the life of a mountain woman. Eli was a patient teacher, showing her how to maintain the cabin, prepare food for long-term storage, identify useful plants and dangerous ones. She learned to split wood without injuring herself, to carry water from the creek efficiently, to keep the fire at the right temperature for different tasks. "You're taking to it faster than I expected," Eli said one afternoon as they worked together to repair a weak spot in the cabin's roof. "Most city folk would be overwhelmed." "Most city folk wanted to be city folk," Clara replied, hammering in a nail with growing confidence. "I never did. I just didn't know there was another option," but their peace was short-lived. A week after the wedding, Garrett made the long ride up to the cabin with troubling news. "Lawrence Whitmore's still in town," he said, accepting the coffee Clara offered. "He's been talking to the territorial judge, filing papers, making a nuisance of himself. And Clara," he looked at her seriously, "he's claiming the marriage isn't legal. Says you were coerced, that Eli took advantage of you when you were vulnerable." "That's absurd," Clara said hotly. "It is, but he's got money for lawyers and he's making formal accusations. Judge Harrison is a fair man, but he's going to have to hear the case. You'll both need to come to town, give testimony, prove the marriage was legitimate and consensual." Garrett paused. "And Clara, you need to know, if Lawrence convinces the judge you weren't of sound mind when you married, the marriage could be annulled. And then he could claim guardianship, take you back east against your will." Clara felt ice form in her stomach. "When?" "Hearing set for 2 weeks from today. You'll need to present yourselves at the courthouse, answer questions before the judge, and probably a panel of witnesses Lawrence is assembling." After Garrett left, Clara and Eli sat in heavy silence. Finally, Eli spoke. "Maybe you should go with him." "What?" Clara stared at him in disbelief. "Not permanently. Just if things go wrong at this hearing, if the judge rules against us, they could make things very difficult. Force you into a sanatorium, claim you're mentally unstable, lock you away for your own good." His voice was tight with fear. "I've heard stories, Clara. Rich families who want to control someone. It's not hard for them to make it happen, especially to a woman. So your solution is for me to give up? Go meekly back to Boston with Lawrence? My solution is for you to be safe." He stood, paced to the window. "I'm not worth risking your freedom for." Clara rose, fury and hurt warring inside her. "Don't you dare make that decision for me. This is exactly what Edmund used to do, decide what was best for me without asking what I wanted. That's not fair, isn't it? You're so afraid of losing me that you'd rather send me away than fight for us." "That's not protection, Eli, that's cowardice." The word hung between them, harsh and true. Eli flinched as if she'd struck him. "You're right," he said finally, his voice rough. "You're right. I'm sorry. I'm just terrified of what they might do to you." Clara went to him, took his hands. "Then help me prepare. Help me be ready to face them. But don't ask me to run. I've spent my whole life running from who I really am. I'm done with that." They spent the next 2 weeks preparing their case. Reverend Mills agreed to testify about Clara's state of mind before and during the wedding. Dr. Brennan prepared detailed medical documentation. Garrett gathered statements from townspeople who'd witnessed Clara's competence and happiness. Even Mrs. Patterson grudgingly agreed to testify that Clara had seemed increasingly healthy and settled during her time in Ironwood. But Lawrence was preparing too. Word filtered back through Garrett that he'd brought additional witnesses from Boston. people who'd known Clara during her marriage to Edmund, who could testify to her melancholy and withdrawn nature, her grief after his death. He'd found doctors willing to state that her ordeal in the blizzard could have caused lasting psychological trauma, impaired judgment, vulnerability to manipulation. He's building a narrative, Garrett explained. Grieving widow, traumatized by near-death experience, swept off her feet by rugged stranger who represents escape from reality. He's going to paint you as someone not thinking clearly, making desperate decisions out of trauma rather than genuine feeling. But that's not true, Clara protested. Doesn't matter if it's true. Matters if it's convincing. Garrett looked troubled. And the thing is, Clara, parts of it do sound convincing if you don't know you. You did suffer a terrible ordeal. You did marry someone very different from your late husband very quickly. Two people who don't understand what you've been through, who don't know what Edmund's control was like. It could seem like you're running from problems rather than toward a solution. Clara felt her confidence waver. How do we fight that? With truth, Eli said firmly. We tell your story, all of it. Not just the blizzard, but your marriage to Edmund, his family's control, what you were really running from. Let the judge see that this isn't about trauma or escape. It's about finally having the courage to live honestly. The night before the hearing, Clara lay awake beside her sleeping husband, fear gnawing at her insides. What if they lost? What if the judge ruled the marriage invalid and granted Lawrence guardianship? She'd heard stories of women confined to asylums by families who found them inconvenient, of lives ruined by the power men held over women's choices. But she'd also found something worth fighting for. Looking at Eli's peaceful face in the moonlight, feeling the solid warmth of him beside her, Clara knew she'd rather face any consequence than lose this. Lose him, lose the life they were building, lose the woman she'd become in these mountains. I won't let them take you, she whispered to the darkness. Whatever it takes, I'm staying with you. As if sensing her distress even in sleep, Eli's arm tightened around her, pulling her close. And wrapped in his embrace, Clara finally found the courage to sleep. They rode into Ironwood at dawn, the April morning cold, but bright with promise. The town was already stirring, and Clara saw people watching from windows and doorways. Some faces were sympathetic, others curious, a few openly disapproving. Let them watch, she thought. Let them see I'm not ashamed. The courthouse was a simple building on the main street, and Judge Harrison's chambers were upstairs, in a room that smelled of leather and tobacco. Lawrence was already there with Margaret, along with two men Clara didn't recognize, lawyers, presumably. And there were others, a severe-looking woman introduced as Dr. Pemberton, a specialist in nervous disorders, a gentleman from Boston named Mr. Carruthers, who'd known the Whitmore family for years, and two women Clara remembered vaguely from society events during her marriage. Quite an assembly, Judge Harrison observed dryly. He was a man in his 60s, weathered and practical, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. Mr. Whitmore, I trust you have good reason for bringing half of Boston to my courtroom. I'm fighting for my sister-in-law's well-being, Your Honor, Lawrence said smoothly. I believe she's been taken advantage of in a vulnerable state, and these witnesses can establish her state of mind both before and after her ordeal. And you, Mrs. McCord? The judge turned to Clara. How do you answer these allegations? Clara stood, felt Eli's steadying presence beside her. I answer that I'm a grown woman who's made a conscious choice to marry a good man and live a life of my own choosing. My brother-in-law's objections have nothing to do with my well-being and everything to do with his desire to control the Whitmore estate and maintain appearances in Boston society. Strong words, Judge Harrison said. I assume you can substantiate them? I can, Your Honor, if you'll allow me to tell my full story, not just the parts that serve Lawrence's narrative. That's exactly what we're here for. This isn't a formal trial, but I'll hear testimony from both sides and make a ruling on the validity of your marriage and your competency to make your own decisions. He settled back in his chair. Now then, let's begin. Clara exchanged one last look with Eli, his eyes full of love and fear and determination. Then she turned to face the judge and began to speak, fighting for her freedom and her future with the only weapons she had: truth and courage. The courtroom was utterly silent when Clara finished. Judge Harrison studied her for a long moment, then said, "Strong testimony, Mrs. McCord. Now I'd like to hear from your husband, Mr. McCord." Eli stood slowly, and Clara saw the effort it cost him, this man who'd isolated himself for 5 years, who avoided the world of men, now forced to stand before judgment and speak. His hands trembled slightly, but his voice was steady. "Your Honor, I'm not educated. Don't have fancy words like the lawyers. But I know what truth is, and I'm going to speak it plain." Judge Harrison nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, Mr. McCord. I found Clara dying in a blizzard. Brought her to my cabin because leaving her would have been murder. I gave her shelter, nothing more, not at first. She was Edmund Whitmore's widow, proper lady from Boston. I was a hermit trapper who hadn't spoken to more than 3 people in 5 years. We had no business together." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "But over those 3 days I saw something in her, a strength she didn't even know she had. A hunger for something real that matched my own. When the storm broke and I took her to town, I thought that'd be the end of it. But it wasn't." Eli's eyes found Clara's. "She came back, offered to teach me reading, and I made excuses, told myself I was just learning skills. But truth is, I was learning her, learning that underneath all that proper Boston polish was someone brave and genuine and alive in ways I hadn't seen since Sarah died." At the mention of his late wife, several people shifted uncomfortably. Eli noticed and continued, "My first wife, Sarah, died in a storm like the one that nearly killed Clara. I blame myself. Spent 5 years hiding in the mountains because I couldn't face a world without her. When I found Clara that night, I saw Sarah, saw another woman dying while I stood by helpless. That's why I rode into that storm when any sane man would have stayed put. I couldn't lose someone else. And yet you married Mrs. Whitmore," Judge Harrison observed. "Weren't you afraid of losing her too?" "Terrified," Eli admitted. "Still am. But Clara taught me something. You can't love someone without risking loss. You can't live without risking pain. I spent 5 years trying to avoid hurt by avoiding life, and all it did was make me half dead myself." He turned to address Lawrence directly, his voice hardening. "You say I took advantage of Clara when she was vulnerable. That's a lie. I gave her shelter, warmth, safety, and I asked nothing in return. She chose to come back. She chose to spend time with me. She chose to love me. And I'll be damned, pardon my language, Your Honor, before I let you take away her right to make those choices." "Mr. McCord," Hutchins interjected smoothly, "isn't it true that Mrs. Whitmore had nowhere else to go? That she was dependent on you for survival?" "For 3 days, yes. After that, she had a teaching position, room at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house, and a salary. She was completely independent. She didn't need me for anything except," Eli's voice softened, "except the things any 2 people need each other for. Companionship, understanding, love." Hutchins repeated skeptically. "After knowing each other mere months. That seems rather convenient." "Sometimes you know," Eli said simply. "I knew with Sarah after 2 weeks. Knew Clara after those 3 days in the cabin. When you've lived long enough, suffered enough, you recognize what matters. And Clara matters, more than my comfort, more than my fear, more than anything except her own happiness and freedom." Judge Harrison leaned forward. "Mr. McCord, if I were to annul this marriage, what would you do?" Eli was quiet a moment. "I'd let her go. If that's what the law decided, if that's what Clara herself wanted, I'd let her go. Because loving someone means wanting what's best for them, even if it tears your heart out. And if she wanted to stay with you, then I'd fight for her with everything I have. Because she's not property to be controlled, or a child to be protected from her own decisions. She's a grown woman who's earned the right to choose her own path." Judge Harrison turned to Clara. "Mrs. McCord, knowing everything you know now, the legal complications, your family's opposition, the difficult life Mr. McCord offers, do you still choose this marriage?" Clara stood, her voice ringing clear. "I do, Your Honor, more than I've ever chosen anything in my life, even though it means giving up your inheritance, your place in society, the security your late husband's family could provide. Those things were never mine. They were chains disguised as gifts. What Eli offers is real. Hard, yes. Uncertain, yes. But real and honest and mine to choose freely." The judge sat back, studying them both. Then he called for other witnesses. Reverend Mills testified to Clara's sound mind and genuine happiness. Dr. Brennan presented his medical assessment, countering Dr. Pemberton's theories with observed fact. Garrett spoke to Clara's competence and Eli's character. Even Mrs. Patterson admitted Clara had seemed increasingly healthy and settled, not traumatized or manipulated. Lawrence's other witnesses, the society women from Boston, could only speak to Clara's quietness during her marriage, which now seemed more evidence of Edmund's control than Clara's instability. Finally, Judge Harrison raised his hand for silence. "I've heard enough. I'll take a brief recess to consider my ruling." Clara and Eli waited in the hallway, hands clasped, barely breathing. The minutes stretched like hours. Reverend Mills sat with them, offering quiet prayers. Garrett paced, muttering about the injustice of rich men using the law as a weapon. When they were finally called back, Clara's heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone must hear it. Judge Harrison sat behind his desk, his expression unreadable. "I've considered all the testimony," he began, "and I'm prepared to make my ruling." Clara felt Eli's hand tighten on hers, felt the entire room holding its breath. "Mr. Whitmore, you've presented a case based on concern for your sister-in-law's welfare. However, your concern appears to be more about control than care. The letters Mrs. McCord shared paint a troubling picture of her first marriage, one that, frankly, makes her desire to escape understandable rather than erratic." Lawrence started to object, but the judge continued. Dr. Pemberton's theories about trauma and impaired judgment might hold water in a different case. But Dr. Brennan, who has actually examined Mrs. McCord, finds her completely competent. And I've observed her myself today, articulate, rational, thoughtful. She doesn't present as someone incapable of making decisions. Judge Harrison looked directly at Clara and Eli. "Marriage is a serious commitment, and yes, this one happened quickly. But I see no evidence of coercion or incompetence. I see two adults who found each other under unusual circumstances and chose to build a life together. That's their right." Clara felt tears start to fall, hardly daring to hope. "Therefore, I rule that the marriage between Clara Whitmore McCord and Eli McCord is valid and binding. Mrs. McCord is of sound mind and fully competent to make her own decisions. Mr. Whitmore's petition for guardianship is denied." The gavel came down and Clara gasped in relief, turning to Eli and finding him already pulling her into his arms. Around them, their supporters erupted in quiet celebration. Reverend Mills wiping his eyes, Garrett grinning broadly, Dr. Brennan nodding with satisfaction. Lawrence stood rigid, his face dark with fury. "This is an outrage." "I'll appeal." "You can try," Judge Harrison said mildly. "But I'll note in my report that I found Mrs. McCord to be one of the most sensible, articulate, and self-possessed women I've had the pleasure of meeting. Any appeal will face an uphill battle." Lawrence and Margaret left without another word, their lawyers trailing behind. The society women followed, whispering among themselves. Only Mr. Carruthers paused at the door, looking back at Clara with something like shame. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I didn't understand. I thought Edmund was a good man. But those letters—" He shook his head. "I'm sorry, Clara, truly." "Thank you," Clara said, meaning it. When they were finally alone outside the courthouse, the afternoon sun warm on their faces, Eli pulled Clara close and kissed her forehead. "We won," he said, wonder in his voice. "You did it." "We did it," Clara corrected. "Together." Spring came to the mountains like a promise kept. The snow melted in rushing streams, revealing earth that remembered how to be green. Wildflowers pushed through dead leaves, painting the hills in purple and yellow and white. Birds returned to fill the silence with song. And Clara McCord, working in the garden plot she and Eli had carved from the hillside near their cabin, felt herself bloom alongside everything else. It had been 6 weeks since the hearing. 6 weeks of building their life together without the shadow of Lawrence's threat hanging over them. 6 weeks of learning what it meant to be truly married, not the hollow pretense she'd had with Edmund, but a real partnership built on respect and love and the daily work of choosing each other. The work was hard. Clara's hands, once soft from a life of leisure, now bore calluses and the occasional blister. Her back ached from hauling water and chopping wood. Her face had been touched by sun and wind until she barely recognized herself in the small mirror Eli had hung by the wash basin. But she'd never been happier. "You're grinning at those tomato plants, like they told you a joke," Eli observed. "I'm coming up the path with a brace of rabbits over his shoulder. I'm grinning because I planted them myself, and they're actually growing." Clara stood, stretching her back. Do you know I never grew anything in Boston? Never put my hands in dirt or watched something I'd planted come to life. It feels," she searched for the word, "miraculous." Eli set down the rabbits and pulled her into his arms, not caring that they were both sweaty and dirt-streaked. "You're miraculous. City woman who adapted to mountain life like she was born to it." "I was born to it," Clara said against his chest. "I just didn't know it until I got here." They prepared dinner together, a routine they'd developed, Eli cleaning the game while Clara prepared vegetables from their growing stores. They worked in comfortable silence, occasionally trading observations about the day, making plans for tomorrow. This was the life Clara had never known to dream of. Simple, honest, filled with purpose and quiet joy. After dinner, as the sun set over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, they sat on the porch Eli was building, another addition to the cabin, giving them a place to watch the world without being fully in it. "I got a letter from Garrett today," Eli said, pulling the envelope from his pocket. "He rode up while you were working the garden. News from town." "Better, news from Boston." Eli handed her the letter. "Lawrence has withdrawn his appeals. Seems the judge's report made it clear any further legal action would be a waste of money. And there's more. Mr. Carruthers has been asking questions about Edmund's business practices. Turns out your late husband's books weren't as clean as everyone thought. Lawrence is too busy protecting the family reputation to worry about you anymore." Clara read the letter, feeling a weight lift that she hadn't realized she was still carrying. "So it's really over?" "It's over." Eli took her hand, laced his fingers through hers. "You're free." "We're free." Free, such a simple word, but it meant everything. Clara looked out at the mountains, at the valley spread below them, at the endless sky above, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. "I want to tell you something," she said. "About that night in the blizzard when you found me. All right, I thought I was going to die. I'd made peace with it, actually. Thought maybe it was fitting, that I'd lived such a small, constrained life, and I'd die the same way. Lost and alone and never having really lived at all." Clara turned to face him. "And then you appeared through the snow and said, 'Follow me home.' 3 words. But they weren't just about physical shelter, were they?" Eli was quiet a moment. "No, I think when I said them I meant something more. I'd been lost too in my own way. And finding you, bringing you back to life, maybe it was a way of bringing myself back too. We saved each other," Clara said softly. "We did." Eli pulled her closer, and they sat in silence as the sun completed its descent and the first stars emerged. Over the following weeks, they settled into the rhythm of mountain life. Clara continued improving her survival skills. She could now shoot well enough to bring down small game, could track animals with increasing accuracy, could read weather signs almost as well as Eli. She'd memorized the trails around the cabin, learned which plants were useful and which were dangerous, developed an instinct for the wilderness that surprised them both, but she also brought her own contributions to their life. She taught not just Eli, but also herself, working through the few books they had and ordering more through Garrett. She wrote letters to Reverend Mills, maintaining a connection to town that kept them from total isolation. She even began working on a journal, documenting their life, recording the stories Eli told her about the mountains and the old trappers who taught him. "You're making history," Eli teased one evening, watching her write by lamplight. "I'm making a record," Clara corrected, "so that someday someone might know that a woman could be happy in the wilderness, that a life doesn't have to be grand or proper to be meaningful." One particularly warm evening in late May, Clara realized she had something important to tell Eli. She'd suspected for a few weeks, but had waited to be certain. "Eli," she said over dinner, her heart racing with a mixture of joy and nervousness. "I'm pregnant." He froze, fork halfway to his mouth, his eyes going wide. Are you sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor. My courses are 2 months late. I've been sick in the mornings and—" She touched her belly. "I just know." Eli set down his fork carefully, as if afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "A baby. We're going to have a baby. Are you happy?" Clara asked, suddenly uncertain. They'd never discussed children, never planned for this. "Happy?" Eli's voice cracked. He came around the table, knelt beside her chair, pressed his hand gently to her stomach. "Clara, I'm terrified and amazed and grateful and, yes, happy. So happy I don't have words for it." They held each other, both crying now, both overwhelmed by the enormity of what they were building together, not just a life, but a family, a future. "Sarah and I always wanted children," Eli said softly, "but it never happened." "I thought that door was closed for me." "Nothing's closed," Clara said, wiping her eyes. "Everything's opening up, for both of us." As summer settled over the mountains, Clara felt herself changing in ways that went beyond the life growing inside her. She was stronger, more confident, more fully herself than she'd ever been. The woman who'd arrived in Montana, grieving, controlled, barely alive, seemed like a distant memory. In her place was someone new, capable, courageous, free. One afternoon, working in the garden while Eli repaired equipment nearby, Clara found herself humming, actually humming with pure contentment. She caught Eli watching her, a smile playing at his lips. "What?" she asked, "just thinking how lucky I am. How that storm brought me the greatest gift I could have asked for." Clara crossed to him, took his weathered face in her dirt-streaked hands. "You know what I realized? I'm not lucky. We're not lucky. We chose this. Every day we choose each other in this life. That's not luck, that's love. You're right." Eli kissed her forehead, her nose, her lips. "And I choose you, Clara McCord. Today and every day after." The baby came in late winter, a daughter with Eli's dark eyes and Clara's determined chin. They named her Sarah Grace. Sarah for the woman who'd taught Eli to love. Grace for the undeserved blessing they'd both received, holding her daughter by the fire while Eli prepared dinner. Clara thought back to that frozen night when a stranger had appeared through a blizzard and offered her salvation in 3 simple words. She'd followed him home and found more than shelter from the storm. She'd found herself outside. Snow fell softly over the mountains, covering the world in clean white. Inside, the cabin was warm with fire and love, and the sound of a baby's soft breathing. Clara looked at her husband, at her daughter, at the life they'd built from loss and loneliness and desperate hope. Sometimes the coldest moments lead us to the warmest hearts. Sometimes being lost is exactly how we find our way home. Clara had found hers, and she was never leaving.